Hi, welcome to the March 1st online hangout for engineering ethics at NJIT. We're in week 7 now, so we're almost halfway through with the semester. There are 15 official lessons for this semester in engineering ethics, but only 14 of those are actually content lessons. The 5th one is sort of a wrap-up, what did you learn? The 15th one. So we only really have 14 lessons, so this is the 7th lesson, this is halfway through. This week we'll be talking about codes of ethics. This will probably be a shorter hangout because there's a little bit less content to talk about. So this is lesson 7. Our goal for this lesson is to think about the professional codes of ethics. So the NSPE, the National Society of Professional Engineers, has a full code of ethics with a preamble and a bunch of different sections and everything. So I want to talk about this. I want to highlight a few of the codes of ethics in the NSPE code, just to bring some of these things out, maybe for discussion. We're supposed to have a discussion like normal this week. However, and this is a big thing that you should keep in mind as we do this lesson. Your assignment for this lesson is not a normal assignment. Normally, you're supposed to just pick something in the readings that you're interested in and then talk about it. But for this lesson, I'm asking you to do something specific. I want you to go to the archives of the NSPE Board of Ethical Review. So there's this website is linked to on the lecture. This is the Board of Ethical Review. They review cases of engineering ethics that call into question some of the codes of ethics. They've been doing this since the 1950s. And every year they look at about a dozen or so cases. So you can go to any one of these cases, or any one of these years, and then pick one of the cases. Each one of the cases has a little PDF here where they talk about the facts of the case. They raise some ethical questions about the case. They talk about which particular codes of ethics are being challenged by this case. And then they give it a long discussion. The discussion is usually pretty detailed, and in particular, it usually refers to other cases in the NSPE code, in the NSPE Board of Ethical Review's case history, where they can compare and contrast this case with other cases that are similar to help draw finer and finer distinctions. So they give a little bit of discussion, and then they come to some conclusion. Either the engineer was acting ethically or was not acting ethically. So for this one, the engineer was acting ethically. Right, so these don't always find that the engineer is doing something wrong. Sometimes it finds that the engineer was doing just fine and was acting within the code of ethics. Both of these things are important for us to understand how these rules work. So the goal of this lesson is to go over some of these cases, learn how the NSPE Board of Ethical Review thinks about its ethical code, thinks about how it applies to specific cases. So your assignment for this lesson, I don't want you to just talk about anything. I want you to go to the archives, look up some particular year, and then give an analysis of that board review. So I have a couple of requirements here that I'm asking you to do. One is make sure that you put the case number and a link to the PDF for that case. If you don't have both the case number and the link to the case, I'm going to take 5 points off right off the bat. This is just to make sure that you're linking me back so I can check your work, so we can all review the case for ourselves. Then once you do that, I want you to just describe the case in your own words. Don't just copy the description from the PDF. I want it to be in your own words to describe the case and to also describe some of the ethical issues at stake. If you'd like, this isn't necessary, but if you'd like, especially if you want more points on the assignment, interpret the case from one of the perspectives of the ethical theories that we've covered in class: deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. It's not always the case that these different theories will say something different about each one of these cases, but some of that analysis might be interesting. If the different theories disagree about the case, that might also be interesting. And then I want you to also talk about the ethical codes underlying the case, why you think those codes are important, how this case is an example of a violation of those codes, and whether you think these policies are fair and clear, whether you think that this is an ambiguous case. If you were in the same situation, would you see that there was an ethical violation or an ethical dilemma here? So I want you to talk about both the case itself, some of these ethical theories. I want you to give an analysis, not just of the case, but also of the policies motivating the case. And then I want you to ask it, is the ruling fair? Do you agree with the board's ruling or not? You might disagree. Be thinking about this case in terms of your own career. What would you do in a similar situation? If you were in that situation, would you find the issues challenging? Would you find it difficult to do the right thing? That kind of stuff. So still just talk about the ethics. There's nothing in particular that I'm looking for apart from the case number and a link to the case. We're talking about this. Part of the point here is to look at a bunch of these cases. So you're still going to have to reply to other people's discussion. So hopefully by the end of this lesson, you'll have looked at least 3 of these cases, or maybe 4 of these cases. So you have some background on that. Yeah. So my plan for this hangout, I want to go over the ethical codes. I have 3 particular cases that I've highlighted on the lecture. I don't know if I'll go through all 3 of them. We'll see how far I get, but I want to talk about a few of these. Please do not consider these 3 cases, 90-4, 89-2, and 92-6. Don't consider these particular cases in your own analysis, because we're going to be doing them here in the Hangout. You can do any of the other cases, though. If you do an old case from the 50s, you might also want to ask yourself, how have things changed, if they've changed at all, since the case was originally decided. All right, so let me see if there's any questions before I get going. I'm about to jump into the material, but if anyone has any questions about this or about the assignment schedule, about the assignments going forward, maybe I should actually say something about that. So this is lesson 7. I think the lesson here is a little bit light in terms of content. I really want you to spend most of the time thinking about the codes of ethics. But if you find yourself with nothing else to do, you might want to look ahead. For lesson 8, next week's lesson, we're going to be doing the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Remember, I have a bunch of sources here. This is supposed to give you an example of the kind of primary sources that I'm looking for you doing your own research on your own research project. So I give an example of the kind of sources that I'm looking for, and maybe even a little discussion of what's important in that piece. I've got lots of details here. This is supposed to be an example of the kind of research that I'm looking for when you do your own research. So use this as an example, look through all this material, get a picture of Deepwater Horizon, and we'll talk about that next week. Lesson 9, same basic idea, except lesson 9 we're going to be talking about climate change. So we're not talking about a single event, we're talking about this massive system. I'll talk about temperature, and I'll talk a little bit about climate science. And then the lesson for that week is about different issues within climate science, especially geoengineering. I have a friend who works on climate science issues related to geoengineering. So we'll talk about that in 2 weeks. That's lesson 9. And then remember, lessons 10 and 11 is your research project week. So for lessons 10, I want you to compile a bunch of research. Your lesson 10 post should mostly be a fact-finding post. Here's what I learned about this event or about this case. Tell me everything that you know. Tell me who's involved, what they did, what happened, what was the aftermath, that kind of stuff. And then in lesson 11 is the analysis week, where I want you to give an ethical analysis of the case that you presented in week 10. So this should be the same case in week 10 and 11. In week 10, you present the facts of the case, and in week 11, you give it an ethical analysis. I'm warning you about these because for a couple of reasons. One is that the assignment is worth almost twice as much as a normal week's assignment. So your grade depends on doing well in these lessons. The other thing is that it will require additional research, maybe library research. That's going to take some time. That's part of the reason why it's worth more points. In addition to the library research, I'm also asking you to do an annotated bibliography. So there's no quiz for lessons 10 and 11. Instead, I'm asking you to do an annotated bibliography for the sources that you compile. So all the details about how to do this are on lessons 10 and 11. I strongly recommend, especially because this week's a little bit light in content, that you look ahead to lessons 10 and 11, get a sense of what this assignment's going to amount to, and maybe even start working on your assignment. at the very least, you should start thinking about what case you want to study, what engineering ethics disaster, what whistleblowing case, right? There's lots of these cases. I give an incomplete list of such cases on that lesson 10 post. You can also look through your textbook for other cases relevant to engineering ethics that you might want to study. You could also potentially look at one of the cases that we've already looked at in more depth, although I ask that you do not do the Pinto case, because we've looked at that to death. And also don't do the Challenger case, because we've talked about that a lot. There's another shuttle explosion, the Columbia case. There's other rocket science, engineering ethics cases, if you're interested in that stuff, aerospace stuff. But start thinking now about what case you want to study. Okay, so I guess I'm about to jump into the lesson. Let me see one more time if there's any questions, comments, concerns, either about the assignment this week or the assignments coming up, or about any of the other material that we've talked about. If you have a question, you can leave it in the chat, or you can just jump on the mic and start talking. I'm going to look at the website to make sure everyone's okay. Oh, for the sign-in grade, yeah, I'm a little bit behind on that. I try to grade your written assignments as fast as possible. The attendance grades can lag behind a little bit. I'll try to catch up on that this week. Don't worry too much about it, though. I will have all these assignments, all the attendance grades online soon, and definitely before the final, or before the end of the grades. Yeah, no problem. Good question. Yeah, I'm sorry I'm a little bit behind on that. Yeah. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the lesson. So the first thing I want to do is actually look at the NSPE Code of Ethics. Actually, before I do that, let me say something about the Board of Ethical Review. So the Board of Ethical Review is a group of engineers and ethicists who the NSPE asks to review these cases. These cases are mostly hypothetical cases, although they might be inspired by real-world events. But when they come before the board, they're stripped of all personal information, they're stripped of all identifying information. And they're mostly designed just to highlight these different ethical issues and maybe ambiguities in the codes, so that the Board of Ethics can decide on the case, and in so doing, that they can clarify what's going on in the codes, and they can make clear what the guidelines are for engineers in practice. I should say right off the bat that the Board of Ethical Review has no legal jurisdiction. The results of these cases don't by themselves have any legal implications at all. The Board of Ethical Review is by the NSPE, and this is sort of their attempt to help clarify what they mean by the Code of Ethics, especially because sometimes these codes can run against each other. For instance, you have one of the codes says that you have an obligation to be honest, and another code says you have an obligation to work in the interests of your clients. And sometimes these two things come in conflict, and so the Code of Ethics doesn't by itself tell you how to resolve these codes, and that's part of why that we're looking at all these cases, or looking at specific cases so that we can see what we ought to do in these particular cases, so we better understand how we should behave ourselves. Again, there's no legal teeth to this. They can't do anything to engineers that they find guilty of violating the code. So engineering licenses are given out by state agencies. It's not giving out on a national basis, it's giving out by individual states. Individual states also have the authority to revoke those licenses. And sometimes individual states work with state chapters of these large engineering professional societies. So there's a New Jersey chapter of the NSPE, and that New Jersey chapter works with the state agency involved in the licensing and censure of engineers. And so, if the state agency is trying to decide whether or not to revoke an engineer's license, then they might ask the local chapter of the NSPE what they would do, and then that chapter would probably look to the history of these case studies to get an idea of how the board would decide. So that's influential. It helps people understand, and lawyers might even use this if they're trying to decide whether to revoke the license of an engineer. But that's the only influence that it has, right? There's no legal precedent being set by these review cases. This is really just for educational purposes, for us to help understand the code. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the code of ethics. So here's the code of ethics. Let's go to the bottom really quickly. This was all revised in 2007 to include a couple of other things about competition. There was also changes about environmental ethics, sustainable development, and so on. That got added recently. So code of ethics is code describing what rules engineers are obligated to keep to. Let me go ahead and read the preamble, because the preamble for any document like this gives the theoretical justification for why they need the code. So the preamble, engineering is an important and learned profession. As members of this profession, engineers are expected to exhibit the highest standards of honesty and integrity. Engineering has a direct and vital impact on the quality of life for all people. Accordingly, the services provided by engineers requires honesty, impartiality, fairness, and equity, and must be dedicated to the protection of the public health, safety, and welfare. Engineers must perform under a standard of professional behavior that requires adherence to the highest principles of ethical conduct. And I just want to emphasize this. The book makes this point also, that engineers are really held to a higher standard of conduct because of their professional role than people have in their normal everyday lives. It might be the case that you're not really obligated to do certain kinds of things just because you're a person, but the code of ethics and the NSPE holds that engineers have a higher standard of ethics than just normal people doing their normal things because of their unique social responsibility, because of the impact they have on the quality of life for all people. And this is really what informs all of the rules, and all of these rules boil down to these fundamental canons. So I think we've looked at these canons before, but again, today we're just going to be looking at them in depth. I'm not going to read all of the rules here, but I'm going to highlight a few of them that are maybe worth talking about, that you might want to talk about in your posts or discussions. All right, so the fundamental canons. Engineers in their fulfillment of their professional duties shall first hold paramount to the safety, health, and welfare of the public. 2, perform services only in areas of their competence. This makes competence the other really important thing. The health and welfare of the public is the really first really important thing. The second really important thing is that engineers display competence and they act only in their areas of competence. All right. The third fundamental thing is that that engineers issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. And we see that honesty is important. In fact, the fifth one is also about honesty. Avoid deceptive acts. The fourth one, act for each employer or client as faithful agents and trustees. So all three of these have to do with honesty, truthfulness, integrity, not being deceptive. And then finally, this is sort of the catch-all, that engineers shall conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. So not only do engineers have an obligation to themselves as engineers and to the public, but they also have an obligation to the profession itself. Someone who fails to uphold the code of ethics makes the whole profession, makes all the engineers look bad. All right. And then so each of these rules elaborate on these canons. Engineers shall hold paramount to the health, safety, and welfare of the public, and then these are elaborations on what exactly that amounts to. So if an engineer's judgment is overruled under circumstances that endanger life or property, they shall notify their employer or client and other such authority as may be appropriate. So notice that this sort of fits DeGeorge's standards for whistleblowing, right? First exhaust your in-house methods for resolving these issues, and then, if appropriate, go beyond the walls of the company. Engineers should only approve those engineering documents that are in conformity with the applicable standards. So this also puts an obligation on the engineers to know the applicable standards. Right? You have to know what the legal and regulatory standards are, and that everything that you're doing is meeting those standards. You have an obligation to work with your client, and that means not revealing information from your client unless you're authorized to or required to by law or this code. So I just want to emphasize this part right here. Required to by law or this code. And this or makes it obvious that sometimes these things can come apart. Sometimes maybe the law doesn't require you to make something known, but maybe this code does. Maybe your obligation to the health and safety and welfare of the public requires that you even break a law and make information known. This is the whistleblowing exception. Right. And right, the idea is that whistleblowing in this case might be required by the code, even if it's not required by law, even if it's maybe against the law. Engineers should not permit the use of their name or associate their business ventures with any person or firm they believe is engaged in fraudulent or dishonest enterprise. So this has to do with the integrity of the profession, the reputation of the profession. So if you're using your name for fraudulent purposes, and that makes the whole profession look bad, you should not engage in unlawful engineering practices. I'm going to sort of skip through some of these because I don't want to read them all. But the second here has to do with competence, that engineers only perform services in their area of competence. So you shouldn't take on jobs that you don't know how to do. And you shouldn't affix your signature to documents that deal with subject matter that are outside of your area of competence. There's one exception to that, and that's if an engineer is overseeing a large project. If an engineer is overseeing a large project, it might be that individual parts of that project get assumed under your responsibility, even though you don't know exactly what's going on with the technical details of that project. And that's okay, you can sign off on the whole project as long as someone who does have the technical expertise, who is qualified, is also signing off on that portion of the project. Right, so this is interesting, partly because this is how engineering practice actually works. It's usually that there's some engineer and then there's a bunch of technicians who are helping the engineer. And it's the engineer who signs off on the whole project, even though the technicians are the ones that are doing the individual things. And part of the point here is that the engineer who's signing off on the project is responsible for that whole project, even the work done by the technicians. So the engineer is responsible, the technicians know what they're doing also, and that they're qualified to do that work. And if there's something that the lead engineer doesn't know how to do, then they have to get someone who is qualified to do that, to take responsibility for that segment. So this is interesting, not only because of its practical application to real engineering work, but also because it shows how these codes involve not just how you behave, but how you cooperate with the rest of the engineers on these jobs. Your obligation isn't just to the public, and not just to the profession in the abstract, its reputation and so on. But you also have an obligation to work with your fellow engineers in particular ways specified by this code. All right, let's keep going. Engineers shall only issue public statements in an objective and truthful manner. You're not supposed to lie. Not only should you not lie, but you should also not withhold information that's relevant. So sometimes there might be pertinent information. Withholding pertinent information, if it's relevant to an issue, is also a form of deception. It's also a form of a failure to be truthful and objective. Engineers are allowed to, in fact, they're encouraged to express their opinions on matters related to their areas of competence, related to their expertise. And in fact, if we go over here to professional obligations, we see that engineers are encouraged to extend the public knowledge and appreciation of engineering and its achievements. So engineers are encouraged by this code to talk to the public about engineering about what engineers can do, about how these projects work. This is part of the unique responsibility of engineers to the public, is that they have an expertise in technical matters that the general public doesn't have. And so it's often the case that the public's interested in something and will come to an engineer to ask them for their opinion, whether something's safe, whether they should trust some design. And engineers are invited, even for things that they're not working on directly, they're invited to talk about this and to use their expertise to help illuminate this for the public, to illuminate the details of engineering for the public. Now, while engineers are encouraged to do this, there can be conflicts of interests when engineers speak to the public, especially when engineers are paid by companies asking them to defend their interests in public. And again, that's fine. The Code of Ethics doesn't say that you can't speak on behalf of a company. If some company is building a bridge and they want you to talk to the public about why the bridge is safe and why they should be happy that this bridge is being built, you're more than welcome to take money to talk to the public about the benefits of this bridge. Given that you don't deceive the public, right, that you're talking in an objective, truthful manner, right, that you're not withholding relevant information, and this is important, that you reveal this interest in your comments, right? You have to preface anything you say by first identifying that you've been paid by these parties. So as long as you recognize, as long as you admit that you're an employee and that you're talking on behalf as a paid employee of the company, then you can speak as an engineer on these technical matters to the public. That's just fine, right? The problem is if you don't disclose these relationships, or if you are giving false testimony, if you're talking about things that aren't true, or if you're withholding relevant information that the public ought to know, right? That's where the ethical concerns are. All right, we're about halfway through the presentation, so I'm going to go ahead and announce the word of the day. The word of the day today is board. I'm meaning that in the terms of board, B-O-A-R-D. But if you put B-O-R-E-D, I would also accept that. But the word for today is board. Board of Ethical Review. If you put that on your sign-in sheet, you will get attendance credit for today's assignment. All right, so back to the lesson. So again, these are each going over each of the canons and the fundamental canons and how that plays out in particular cases. So engineers shall act as for each employer or client as faithful agents and trustees. That you will act in your client's interest as long as it doesn't go against the health and safety and welfare of the public, as long as it doesn't require that you violate any of these other canons. So remember, you should disclose all or potential conflicts of interest. Notice that even potential conflicts of interest should be disclosed. Your obligation is to you have an obligation not just to do the right thing, but to also provide the appearance of doing the right thing. If it appears that you're doing the wrong thing to the general public, even if you're not, even if you're doing the right thing, if it appears that you're doing the wrong thing to the general public, then this jeopardizes the reputation of engineers. It calls into question your objectivity and reliability, and it calls into question your integrity. So this is part of this higher standard for engineers, right? It's not just that you do the right thing, but that you give the appearance of doing the right thing also. And so a lot of that has to do with gift giving, how contracts are assigned. If it looks like you're getting unfair treatment in contracts or in regulations and legal aspects of engineering, these things are not good. Again, even the mere appearance is bad. And then engineers should avoid deceptive acts. should not falsify your qualifications. All your brochures should actually, in any presentation that you do about the business, what you're capable of, should be truthful. It should actually represent your capabilities. It should not misrepresent facts about employers, employees, and so on. Engineers should not give, solicit, or receive, either directly or indirectly, any contribution to influence the award of a contract by a public authority, or which may be reasonably construed by the public as having the effect or intent of influencing the awarding of a contract. This is this point I was making earlier, that even if you're doing the right thing, if it's reasonably construed by the public as doing the wrong thing, then that's also a violation of the code. Even if you're doing the right thing, even if you're within the legal guidelines, the appearance of wrongdoing is enough to be a violation of this code. Just for instance, recently the Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia died. He died while he was at a hunting resort in Texas, and he was at this resort for free. This resort never charges its customers. He was invited, and he didn't have to pay for it, to this hunting vacation. It turns out that the people who owned this resort also had cases that were coming before the Supreme Court. Now, this doesn't mean that Scalia was taking bribes to decide the case in their favor, but it can be reasonably construed by the public as having some, the appearance of corruption, that there's some unethical relationships being developed here. And that mere appearance, even if there's no actual corruption or coercion or other illegal activity going on, the mere appearance of some connection is enough to be in violation of the Code of Ethics. All right, let's keep going. Professional obligations. Engineers shall be guided by the highest standards of honesty and integrity. These are all fairly straightforward. We've talked a lot about this in our discussions of integrity, honesty, and the rest of the virtues. Engineers shall strive at all times to serve the public interest. Engineers are encouraged to participate in public affairs, in community activities, as part of this attempt to extend to the public knowledge and appreciation of engineering and its achievements. All right, so you have an obligation to be a representative for engineering as a career, according to this Code of Ethics. Sustainable development. The Code of Ethics also recognizes an obligation to principles of sustainable development, so wasteful stuff is against the Code of Ethics. You shouldn't disclose confidential information from your client unless it goes against this code. Be careful of conflicts of interest. Whatever job you get, you might end up going through certain kinds of state-mandated training. And a lot of the training has to do with when you can accept gifts, when can you accept other kinds of special treatment privileges, and when are those things in violation of the ethical codes. And there's a lot of very strict rules about when you can and cannot accept gifts. And New Jersey in particular is very strict about these gifts. So I couldn't, if you wanted to give me an apple, like you give a teacher an apple, that's fine. But if you wanted to give me like a mug with my name on it or something like that, then that's in violation of the ethical code. Right? The reason, even if you just wanted to give it to me to be nice because you liked my teaching, the appearance that giving me this gift, it appears that it could appear to other students that when you give me this gift that you're getting special treatment on your grades. So I'm not allowed to accept gifts from students at all, unless it's something like an apple that can be consumed right away. So you're allowed to take gifts that are like coffee and donuts before a meeting, but you're not allowed to take actual personalized gifts. Of course, yeah, I was going to show Chris Christie taking baseball tickets. Chris Christie has taken all sorts of gifts and so on, being the governor, and these activities are in clear violation of the New Jersey state ethics policy, but no one really holds him responsible. Here's another thing in the Code of Ethics. Engineers shall not obtain employment or advancement through untruthfully criticizing other employers or by other improper or questionable methods. So you have an obligation not to badmouth other engineers in order to get a job. If you're badmouthing other engineers, especially if you're lying about other engineers, this is against the Code of Ethics. Engineers should not attempt to injure maliciously or falsely, directly or indirectly, the professional reputation, practice, prospects, practices, or employment of other engineers. I guess I'm going to let you go through the rest of the Code of Ethics. Let me see if there's any questions. Ask what happens if the gift is like a pencil or a notebook? A pencil might work. Notebooks, maybe not. Large gifts, especially personalized gifts, are usually looked at as a violation of the Code of Ethics. All right, I'm going to give an example from my own career as a teacher. So I'm not an engineer. I've never worked as an engineer. Yeah, so they're asking in the chat about what kind of gifts are acceptable and not acceptable. I should say, first of all, that what gifts are acceptable, these are usually state-mandated policies, and it'll change from state to state. So the policy in New Jersey is really, really strict, and I've worked in states that didn't have restrictions as strict. One of the things that the New Jersey ethics orientation talks about is that there's this misconception, it's not true, but that there's a $20 limit to gifts. And people sometimes act like as long as the gift is under $20, it's okay to take it, but if it's over $20, it's not okay to take it. So this is not true. In fact, there's no lower minimum of cost that they're allowed to give gifts on. Instead, the restriction has to do with the utility of the thing. So if it's a personalized gift, even if it's like a $10, like a $10 mug that has your name on it, might not be acceptable. It's not just about the price of the item, but it's about how it's used. The kinds of items that they accept are really like a pencil might be okay, especially because a pencil is sort of disposable. A pen might also be okay. Maybe a pad of paper. But the ones that they're very clear about are things like coffee and donuts before a meeting. So if you're having a meeting, someone can come and give you coffee and donuts before the meeting, and you can take that coffee and donuts without it being a violation of the gift. But if they're taking you out to a dinner, or if they're taking you out even to an elaborate lunch, that's more than just a simple lunch. These things count as violations of the ethical code. Again, like I said, Chris Christie is violating these ethical codes all the time, and so a lot of it has to do with whether anyone's going to actually prosecute you for these things. And no one's actually bringing Chris Christie before a judge to see whether this is okay. But if you're a low-level engineer, maybe people will push on you a little bit harder to maintain these ethical codes. The example from my own career, so I've never been an engineer, but I've been a teacher for a long time. And when I was an undergrad, I was an undergrad at the University of California, Riverside, and I was an employee for Riverside as a math tutor. So I taught math, and there was this one kid who I tutored him for like 3 years of his undergraduate career, and he passed a lot of math classes, largely in part to the work that I did with him. He wouldn't have passed those classes if I hadn't been working with him, but we worked for a long time, and he passed a bunch of classes partly because of our tutoring experience. So at the end of this, he's about to graduate. He doesn't need my tutoring anymore, and he decides to give me, as a gift to thank me for these years of tutoring, he gives me a Best Buy gift card, a $100 gift card to Best Buy. Now, I'm a employee of the university, which is a state institution, and as an employee, I'm not allowed to take gifts from the students. The students also don't pay for their tutoring. They get the tutoring free, so I'm not allowed to take anything from the students. But the question was, should I take this gift card? And you might think that I should take the gift card because he's giving it to be nice. He's giving it as a thank you gift, for the work that we've done over several years. It's meaningful to him, and you might think that I'm taking and I'm not really doing anything wrong. He's not asking me to cheat for him. I mean, any more than tutoring is a kind of cheating to begin with, right? So he's not asking me to violate any rules. He's not asking me to be corrupt at all. He's just trying to show his appreciation with this gift. This is what I thought at the time, and so I accepted the gift at the time. I bought a video game with it. But in the time since, I've sort of wondered whether I should have taken that gift. The reason here doesn't have to do with whether I did anything wrong, but it has to do with the appearance of doing something wrong. So if my other tutoring students had seen that I was taking this large gift, $100 from one of my students, they might ask, well, why is he giving you all that money? What did you do for him that made you give him all that money? And then, why aren't you doing that for me? Are you helping him pass his classes? Are you cheating for him? You might be cheating for him, or whatever service you're doing for him. Why aren't you doing that for me? And so you can see how just the appearance of impropriety from taking this gift might look to other students like something is going wrong, like I'm showing some kind of favoritism, or that there's been some other violation. For most states, New Jersey included, the ethics policy would not have allowed me to take that gift, and I should have refused it. I should have turned it down. That's difficult to do. It depends on how people. So Kevin says it depends on how people sees it. It depends on how people see it, whether it's right and wrong, maybe. But in terms of whether it violates the ethical standard, the ethical code, I think it's pretty clear that it does violate the ethical code to take the money. The problem is turning down that money is kind of awkward, right? This person wants, he's trying to be nice. He's trying to show his appreciation, and to turn something like that down is kind of insulting, and it kind of makes it awkward social relationship between me and him. So I want to accept it for the sake of the social reasons. There's this social pressure to accept the gift, but then at the same time, there's this ethical issue that it looks like something is going wrong. So I think the ethical code is clear that I shouldn't have accepted that gift. Now, this might be the case for engineering. I do know that in some other professions would decide this case a little bit different. So my girlfriend, my partner, is a psychologist. She's a clinical psychologist, and she works with people who are often have issues like they're depressed, maybe even suicidal. Sometimes these people develop very close relationships with my girlfriend because of these very traumatic kinds of situations, and it's often the case that at the end of their sessions, or at the end of a round of sessions, the client might want to give her a gift. One example was a client had knitted a scarf, and wanted to give her the gift of the scarf to thank her for these therapy sessions. And in psychology, it's a little bit different because in this case, the people, if they're depressed, if they have low self-esteem, maybe turning down a gift like that is bad for their mental health. That might drive them deeper into depression, for instance, and that's not a good thing. So in psychology, you still shouldn't take gifts from clients, especially if it's an unhealthy relationship with the client. But certain cases like this where they make a scarf, maybe for the sake of the client, you don't turn it down, for the sake of their mental health. But it's not as common that you're going to get these kinds of cases in engineering. Some engineering decisions are life or death decisions, but it's usually not a life or death decision about whether an engineer accepts a gift or not. So just be careful, be very cautious when you get gifts. And also remember that things that don't look like gifts don't have to be wrapped in a package with a little bow. Sometimes when you go to conferences and there'll be a business that invites you out to a dinner, like a fancy dinner, and then pays for it, that's a gift. And that might look like an ethical violation if it comes up. So be aware of those kinds of things. Be aware of who's giving you what, where it's coming from, and what it looks like to the public. Even if you know you're not doing anything wrong, think about how it appears. Would someone else think that this relationship or this transaction was inappropriate? Okay. So I've talked a lot more than I thought I was going to talk. I want to just look at these cases really briefly so you see how they work. But if anyone has any other questions or comments, please leave them. So yes, I'm going to jump into some of these cases. So like I said, in lesson 7, I pull up 3 different cases: 98-4, 98-2, 92-6, just so you can get a feel of how these cases work. I want to go over these cases. Remember, don't use these cases yourself in your analysis. This is just so that we can go over them together. So this one's quick. Let me just read the case, and then we'll talk about it. So in this case, engineer X is employed by firm Y, a medium-sized engineering consulting firm controlled by engineer Z. Engineer X is one of the few is one of the few engineers in firm Y with expertise in hydrology, but the firm's work in the field of hydrology does not constitute a significant percentage of the firm's work. Engineer X, an associate with the firm, gives 2 weeks' notice of her intention to move on to another firm. Thereafter, engineer Z, the principal in firm Y, continues to distribute a brochure identifying engineer X as the employee of the firm and list engineer X on the firm's resume. Right, so basically, engineer X works for the firm for a while. The firm puts engineer X on all their brochures and all their literature that they pass around. And then engineer X decides to leave the firm, but they still pass out this literature. So she gives her 2 weeks' notice, but they still pass out the literature. So is this unethical? Is it unethical for the engineer Z to continue representing firm Y as if engineer X was an employee, when in fact she's given her 2 weeks' notice? I don't know if anyone has any responses to this. If anyone wants to jump in with an analysis, please do. So the Board of Ethical Review here cites the couple of codes in the ethical code about objectivity and truthfulness, not misrepresenting. There's even, we talked about this when we went through the code, the specific passage about brochures should not misrepresent pertinent facts concerning employees, and so on, and their qualifications. So is firm Y unethical for releasing these brochures after engineer X gave their 2 weeks' notice? Okay, so the Board of Ethical Review is discussing these cases, and they relate it to a few other cases. One of the things that the board recognizes is that it's not cheap to produce these brochures, and you can't just change these brochures overnight. There's some time that goes into printing up new brochures, especially when you have a bunch of them laying around. Yeah, so in this particular case, so they talk about this other case, 83-1, in which there's this malicious misrepresenting of facts by an engineer, right, where they are specifically describing facts for the firm other than they are. But in this case, the board says there's nothing like that. There's no malice or poor intent. As far as we can tell from the facts of the case that were given, maybe the firm decides to change their brochures after engineer X leaves, but it just hasn't happened yet, and that's going to take some time. So because the engineer X hasn't left the firm entirely, has just put in their notice, there's this sort of wiggle room that the firm has where they haven't really misrepresented any facts, and they haven't done it maliciously. So it's okay to still distribute these brochures while engineer X has given her 2 weeks of notice. That doesn't mean that you can pass out false material all the time. You need to make sure that you're not misrepresenting your firm. But in this case, especially because hydrology isn't an important part of the firm, then this isn't really a deep misrepresentation. It's the kind of thing that can be easily corrected by printing out a new brochure after engineer X leaves. So for this reason, the board decides that it's not unethical for engineer Z to continue to represent engineer X as an employee of firm Y in the circumstances described. All right, so you might have been confused about this kind of case. Is it unethical to keep distributing this brochure even though it's going to be out of date very soon? And the board says no, it's not unethical. You can keep distributing that as long as you change it after engineer X leaves, as long as you're not trying to deliberately deceive people about what's going on in your firm. Then there's no ethical violation here. Yeah, it's okay during her last week, but not when she's no longer an employee. After she's left the firm, when she's no longer an employee, then you want the brochures to be up to date. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean printing up new brochures. It might just mean, going through the brochures and striking out that person's part of it, or maybe adding a supplement that revises who's actually part of the firm. Right? So there's other ways of dealing with it besides printing out new firms immediately. But you do have some obligation to keep this literature up to date and accurate. And so when the engineer X leaves, then you need to change the brochures. Good. Yeah, they have a certain time period to change. This ruling doesn't give what that time period is exactly. The ruling is just that it has to be as up to date as possible, and that might require doing reprints or changing the brochures. Especially after engineer X leaves, saying that engineer X is still part of the firm would be a misrepresentation of the firm. So you have some obligation to keep the thing up to date. There's some ambiguity here, right? The board realizes that it takes time to do this kind of stuff. So maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room. But if it's a year after engineer X has left and you're still passing out brochures that she's in the firm, then that's a violation, right? That's a misrepresentation. Good, good, good. Let's go on to the next case. This is case 89.89-2. This also has to do with an employment issue. So let me go just read the case. So the city of Orion began a recruitment process for the first week of January for a city engineer public works director. The recruitment was necessitated by the pending retirement of the former city engineer public works director in May, which they began the hiring process in January in preparation for the works director to leave in May. The city wanted to have a new employee on board for orientation and training prior to the incumbent leaving. The city received a great number of applications and went through laborious tasks of screening for finalists. During the screening period, engineer A was in the area and requested an appointment to gather more information regarding the position. The appointment was granted, and engineer A was given more information regarding the position, the city, housing, schools, etc. Engineer A expressed a strong interest in the position and stated he had friends living close by. He also stated that he was familiar with the area. Engineer A was one of the 4 finalists interviewed for the position during the first week of March and was selected as the best qualified candidate. An offer of employment was extended to engineer A on March 10th, which was accepted. Engineer A agreed to start employment on or before April 10th. So engineer A goes through the entire hiring process, accepts the offer, and then agrees to start employment on the 10th. But then during the period between March 15th and April 10th, several phone conversations were held with engineer A, during which he expressed some doubt about his ability to start on April 10th due to his obligation to his current employer and personal reasons. Engineer A was advised by the city that he would be permitted to return to his former home for meetings to satisfy his current employment obligations. Engineer A was also advised by the city that if he was hesitant about employment for his personal reasons, the city could understand, but it would appreciate a decision so that it could begin a new recruitment process. Each time this was discussed, Engineer A stated that he wanted the position and would be there to start no later than April 10th. On April 5th, the Engineer A advised the city that he could not start on April 10th, but he could start on April 24th. And then Engineer A assured the city that this was a firm commitment, but then on April 23rd, Engineer A advised the city that he could not take the position. So again, so the question is, was it ethical for Engineer A to deal with the city in the manner described? And again, the Code of Ethics for dealing with employers and clients as faithful agents and trustees, do not be deceptive. So in this case, Engineer A was basically stringing the city along, possibly to get a better, to better negotiate their job elsewhere. But Engineer A accepted the position, strung the city along for a month, for over a month, and then eventually denied the position, even after several times making firm commitments for the position. So it's not surprising that the board finds that this was unethical for the engineer to deal with the city in the manner described, that it was deceptive, that the engineer has an obligation to deal with the city honestly. Now, that said, the engineer does recognize that moving to another job, maybe even in another city, is a huge choice. It's a difficult choice. Lots of considerations go into it. And it's going to take time to make those decisions. So it's not wrong to have the beginnings of these kinds of negotiations. The problem here is the stringing along, right? That the engineer made misrepresentations of to his prospective employer, misrepresented his commitments, misrepresented the time frame in which he can decide these things. Even if job seekers take great pains to accommodate the interests of the potential employer, this goes beyond that to the point that it's unethical. He's not acting faithfully. Engineer A's actions were not justifiable under the letter or spirit of the code. Well, there may be circumstances where a prospective employee may be justified in providing less than full disclosure. Oh, this is another thing. The issue is about whether the engineer is required to fully disclose all his interests, especially what other negotiations he's going through in his own home city. And the code recognizes that employees aren't required to entirely fully disclose everything because part of the point of a job interview like this is to present yourself in the best possible light. So obviously engineers are going to I'm sorry, does someone else want to talk? I got muted. Maybe not. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so when you're applying to a job, you don't always describe yourself entirely accurately. You play up your strengths and you downplay your weaknesses. And the Code of Ethics, the review board recognizes that this is justifiable in some ways. But as a fact for this case, it's not merely just exaggerating strengths and underplaying weaknesses. This is the engineer stringing along the employer for a long period of time in a way that was just not acceptable according to both the spirit and the letter of the code. Okay, I was going to do one more, but these are pretty straightforward, I think. Go ahead and read this other case on your own. Look for another case also for you to give your own analysis of one of these cases. I'm interested to see what you guys have to say. I think that's the end of the Hangout today. Remember to sign in on the sign-in sheet with the word of the day, which I mentioned about halfway through the lesson. If there are no more questions, that's the end of the Hangout. I will see you all next week.